capitalism is not a moral problem. It's not because capitalists are evil or anything like that. And I'm not saying that obviously to defend any capitalists, but the reason I think that's important is because it's the solution is not to have better capitalists or to transform them into more moral. It's not a moral problem. It's not about moral education. It's a political problem. It's about dismantling the economic structures that forces everyone to obey the logic of profit.
Despite extreme levels of inequality, poverty, and ecological destruction, capitalism remains to be the dominant form of organizing social life. Not only that, it seems that each of us is in some way involved in its continuation. We constantly reproduce the world we live in. Through our everyday activities and interactions, we keep the existing social order going. But why? And why does it seem so difficult to simply step out of it? Marxist philosopher Søren Mau argues that the answer lies in what he calls economic power. When we think of power, we usually imagine forms of domination that involve coercion, violence, or ideological influence. In much of social theory, these are seen as mechanisms that keep the existing social order in place. Against this background, Mau suggests that power can also operate independently of individual intentions. It can also operate impersonally through the social and economic conditions that structure our everyday lives. To understand this, we now turn to Søren Mau and his concept of economic power.
My name is Søren Mau, and I'm an unemployed researcher. To begin with, there's something paradoxical about the persistence of capitalism, because capitalism is an extremely unstable system. It's an incredibly chaotic and unstable social order. So in a sense, I think it's paradoxical that capitalism has managed to persist for so long, for let's say 400 or 500 years. Despite generating constant crises and constant political instability and social unrest and so on. And I think most critical scholars have tended to explain the reproduction of capitalism or the persistence of capitalism with reference to two forms of power that have usually been taken to be the only two forms of power that exists, and those two forms of power are violence and ideology. So there's one tradition of scholarship that has focused a lot on the role of violence in the reproduction of capitalism, especially the violence of the state. For example, capitalism would not be able to persist if it didn't have a police and military that is able to, with the capacity to enforce property rights, for example. So, but in many other ways, the violence of the state has been constantly necessary for establishing capitalism and reproducing it throughout the history of capitalism. And then there's another tradition that has focused more on the role of ideological power, which is a form of power that functions by shaping how we think and perceive ourselves and our surroundings. So a lot of critical scholars have emphasized how capitalism relies on ideological power for its reproduction. And I think both of these traditions are completely right about that violence and ideology are necessary forms of power in capitalism, that capitalism cannot exist and reproduce itself without violence and ideology. But I also think that there's more to the power of capital than that capitalism is also, that a crucial part of how capitalism reproduces itself is that that there is a third form of power what we could call an economic form of power, which is directly embedded in the economic processes itself in capitalism, and functions in an abstract and anonymous, impersonal way, so that the very way that the economic processes are organized in capitalism helps to reproduce capitalism, which is a form of power that's not as immediately visible as the other forms of power. Of course, the most visible form of power is the violence of the state. Everyone can see that when the police enforces property rights. Ideological power can be a bit more difficult sometimes to identify, but I also think that we should consider, for example, market movement, price signals, price movements as a form of power. Although it doesn't have a directly identifiable source that you cannot point to a person who exercises this power. But nevertheless, I think it is a form of power that helps to reproduce capitalism. So most critical studies of the reproduction of capitalism have focused on violence and ideology, and my project is not to say that they are wrong in a way, but just to say that that's not the whole picture, that there's more to the power of capital than that.
The different forms of power have exercised different degrees of influence in the reproduction of capitalism. Some scholars, such as Louis Althusser, for example, have argued that the role of violence has declined in its ability to exercise power to reproduce the system. While Mau accepts that the role of violence has changed historically, he argues that violence remains central to the reproduction of capitalism today.
I think we should be careful to avoid too broad historical generalizations about the forms of power that reproduce capitalism. I think violence, for example, was obviously extremely important and central to the establishment of capitalism, or the creation of capitalism in the 16th, 17th century. But it's also extremely important today. And even if violence is not violence is a coercive, violent power is not only working when it's exercised, but also as it also functions as a threat. That we all know that the police will be there to enforce property rights, for example. That's often enough to keep people from challenging property rights. So I wouldn't claim that. I wouldn't say that that there's a clear tendency for violence to become less central, for example, throughout the history of capitalism. At the same time, I also think that it is possible to identify certain historical periods where the role of violence has been easier to identify, or has been more pronounced than in other periods. And I think, for example, it makes sense in a way that the socialists in the late 19th century and early 20th century emphasized the role of state violence in the reproduction of capitalism more than later generations of socialists did. Because, for example, in the 19th century, socialist parties were illegal and were immediately in a country like Germany, for example. Unions and socialist movements, socialist parties were subjected to direct violent state repression, in a way that they aren't today. And also there are many other aspects of how the world was in that period that would have made it more obvious to focus on the role of violence. For example, the wave of imperialist conquest of or imperialist expansion of capitalism through colonialism in the early 20th century. That was also something that made it very clear to everyone how central the extreme violence of the state was to the expansion and reproduction of capitalism. And then I think, for example, later in the 20th century, the widespread support in Western Europe for fascism among the in the working class, and the fact that that such a large part of the working class, for example, voted for Hitler or supported fascist movements in other countries in Europe in the 30s. That was, for example, one of the good reasons why people started focusing more on violence. Like someone like Wilhelm Reich in Germany, like asking questions about what, how, trying to understand why did proletarians not automatically support the revolutionary socialists, but actually supported fascist regimes. So that was one obvious historical reason why people became more concerned with ideological power. So in that way, I think that there are certain historical circumstances gives rise to attention on these different forms of power, but I think they're all working constantly in one way or another, throughout all phases of capitalist development.
Mao now turns to his conception of economic power. He argues that a simple way to grasp it is through money. In our social order, everyone depends on money in order to live their lives. We are therefore deeply dependent on it to reproduce ourselves materially. For Mao, this dependence is a basic way in which the economic system exercises power over us.
One very simple way that we experience economic power in our daily life is the need to find money, to get money, to earn money. The need to sell our labor power. Most of us have to find money. Most of us are not born with so many resources that we don't have to ever get a job. Most of us need to earn money to make a living somehow, to find money to pay for rent, to pay for food, to pay for the things we need. That situation is a great example of economic power, and it's so obvious that it doesn't appear in our daily lives as a exercise of power, even though it is. And the thing is that the fact that we do not have direct access to the things we need, and that we have to make money to get access to them, means that we usually that it's usually not necessary for anyone to use violence to get us to sell our labor power, to subject ourselves to someone else, to a boss, to a company, because it's simply necessary to do that in order to make a living. So in that way, we enter into a relationship of exploitation with an employer because we need to do that in order to live, not because someone forces us to do it with violence. That's the typical situation in capitalism. So that's an example of economic power, that we're put in a way. What the concept of economic power highlights is that the very situation that we find ourselves in a capitalist society, where we have to make certain choices in order to survive, is a result of not only a result of not only a result of power, but also it's a way of exercising power. And so another example is price movements. For example, if the rent goes up, if the rent levels go up, or if the prices of basic necessities like medicine or food go up, then we need to rearrange our lives in order to make more money. We have to move to another place if the rent is too high, or if medicine we are dependent on is expensive, for example, becomes more expensive, then we have to make money we have to find a way to make money in order to be able to pay for that. So we constantly make decisions about how to live our lives, and we make decisions with reference to things like prices, and that's an exercise of power because it shapes our lives in a way. So the it movement of prices on the market shapes the conditions in which we make choices about the lives that we live. And that's an example of power, of economic power. So the economic power is a form of power that is indirect, that works by shaping our surroundings rather than addressing us directly. And that's different from violence as well as ideology, because violence works by directly addressing us. For example, like a policeman, a cop saying, like threatening with violence or threatening with jail or arresting us if we challenge property rights, for example. Or an ideology is also in that way a form of direct power, in that it directly shapes the way that we understand ourselves and our surroundings. But economic power is a form of power that works by shaping our social and material environment in a way that forces us to do certain things.
According to Mau, an important concept for understanding economic power is class. Within Marxist theory, class is generally understood in terms of ownership over the means of production. Those who own the means of production form the capitalist class. Those without means of production must sell their labor power in order to survive and therefore make up the working class. Workers are therefore subjected to the pressures of the labor market in order to secure the means of their existence. But according to Mau, economic power ultimately extends beyond class relations. Even capitalists themselves remain subjected to its logic and constraints.
So the economic power of capital includes mechanisms of power that are class specific, or mechanisms of class domination, but also includes mechanisms of power that transcend class. So that means that the economic power of capital also includes mechanisms of domination that everyone is subjected to, regardless of their class position. So everyone in capitalist society is subjected to the power of the market in a way, to the pressures of competition, and that's an important thing for understanding how capitalism works. That capitalist companies, are also subjected to the pressure of the market. That competition is a mechanism through which different sections of the ruling class impose a certain logic on each other in a way. And that's why the problem is not. That's why it's not a moral. Capitalism is not a moral problem. It's not because capitalists are evil or anything like that. And I'm not saying that obviously to defend any capitalists, but the reason I think that's important is because it's the solution is not to have better capitalists or to make them, to transform them into more moral. It's not a moral problem. It's not about moral education. It's a political problem. It's about dismantling the economic structures that forces everyone to obey the logic of profit. But at the same time, so it's important to emphasize how capitalism forces everyone to act in a certain way, but it's also important to emphasize that people in different class positions are forced to do different things. So what the universal domination of the market does or forces capitalists to do is to impose certain ways of working, for example, on the workers, or to dominate the workers. So I think it's important to have both of these things in mind, to see how capitalism is at the same time, or the power of capital is at the same time class transcending and class specific, because capitalism presupposes a certain class structure where the conditions of the life of society, our common resources that we all depend on, is controlled by a minority of by an elite minority of society, by the capitalist class, and that's why everyone else is dependent on, becomes dependent on the market. So this raises the question of how we define class, and I think there are different ways of defining class that can be useful for different types of analyses and for different purposes. I think that if we want to understand the power of capital and how that works, it's important to avoid a narrow idea of class as defined by the relationship of exploitation. So that's a traditional way of understanding this central class antagonism in capitalism between the exploited workers and the exploiting capitalists. But that relationship between workers and capitalists depend on a much broader class relationship between capitalists and not only workers but proletarians, which is a broader category because being a proletarian means to be dispossessed, to be excluded from property, to be excluded from direct access to the things that people need in order to survive. So that what defines the proletarian condition, and so the crucial thing to see is the crucial thing to understand here is that the relationship between the relationship of exploitation between workers and capitalists presupposes that workers cannot rely on other people who have access to what they need in order to survive. So it presupposes a broader relationship of class domination. So the proletariat not only includes workers, but also people who don't work, what is in the Marxist tradition called the relative surplus population. And it's important to explain what that concept means, because no one is a surplus in themselves. I mean, no one is superfluous in themselves. The word relative is crucial here. It's the relative surplus population are those people who are a surplus in relation to the needs of capital. So it's people who are surplus from the point of view of capitalist production, which means that it's not profitable to exploit them. So capitalism needs a certain amount of people to be unemployed. That's another way of explaining what that concept means. So the proletariat also includes people who are unemployed, and people who are sick and are unable to work, but it also includes people who work outside of the wage relation as unpaid domestic workers, for example. So in that way, the central class antagonism of capitalism is not just between workers and capitalists, but between proletarian and capitalists, between those who are excluded from control over the conditions of social reproduction and those who control the conditions of social reproduction. So that's how I would define class, as a relationship to the conditions of social reproduction. And by social reproduction here, I mean all of the activities and processes that are necessary to reproduce society. So it's a very broad category. Basically, it's an alternative way of saying the economy.
But we should ultimately ask why the capitalist order is able to exercise this kind of power over people in the first place. Mau argues that this relates to what he calls the corporeal nature of human beings. According to Mau, humans are dependent beings. To survive, we rely on material resources, tools, and cooperation with others. This also means that we depend on the social conditions that make these things available to us.
Yeah, so I think Marx has some interesting ideas about human nature and the human body that helps us understand why such a thing as economic power is possible in the first place. why it's possible for human beings to entangle their own reproduction or the reproduction of the species in this strange form of social domination. And so the idea is that I try to develop on the basis of Marx's writings is that the human being is biologically underdetermined, to use a expression from the British philosopher Kate Sober. And that means that there's no natural way for the human being to organize its the reproduction of the species. There's no naturally immediately given way of organizing human reproduction. It's up to us to figure out politically, collectively, how to do that. And the reason why we are biologically underdetermined is because of the specific structure of the human body. And one of the crucial things here is the human dependency on tools. The fact that human being needs tools in order to reproduce itself. So that's a crucial difference between humans and other animals. Of course, there are many examples of animals that use tools, but not not in this on the same scale and in the same degree of complexity as human tool use. So humans necessarily use tools in order to reproduce themselves, but there's no specific set of tools that's necessary, and especially not on an individual level. So it's a necessity on the level of the human collective, or the human species. And that means that we are uniquely flexible in our relationship to our surroundings. So whereas many other animals have certain organs that are functionally related to a specific environment and have a ecological niche in that way, humans don't really have a natural habitat, which means that we are in a way naturally homeless, but also that we can be at home everywhere almost, because instead of having organs that are functionally related to a certain environment, we develop tools, technologies as a kind of extension of the body, as external organs that can be developed and put to use in different environments. So we transform our environment to an extremely high degree compared to other animals. So the point of all of this is that the human being is extremely flexible in its relationship to the rest of nature, and that there is an extra dimension in the relationship between the human body and its environment compared to other animals, and that extra dimension is tools and technologies. And that also means that the human being is vulnerable to economic power, and that economic power becomes possible because relationships of domination can insert itself in that gap in a way between the human being and its surroundings, which means that relationship of domination in that way can become a necessary precondition for reproducing life itself. So relationships, power relations or relationships of domination can insert itself on the most fundamental level of the reproduction of human life. And in that way, the unique human capacity for transforming our surroundings and the unique freedom and flexibility of the human being in its relationship to its surroundings is also what makes it possible for a capitalist society to dominate everyone so much.